Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. Today's date is November 29, 2020, and this is an audiobook of Sexual Politics by Kate Millett from 1968. This file is hosted at Marxists.org, the Marxists Internet Archive, and they've included a prefatory note that this 1968 essay by Kate Millett was circulated before the publication of her book, Sexual Politics. The ideas within it were later incorporated into Chapter 2 of the book, which is a feminist classic. So I also would like to add a prefatory note. The other day I put up a video on this channel called BeardTube's Maleness Problem about how currently the online Marxist-Leninist culture seems to be very male-dominated. And when I mentioned this, I will say that the response was overwhelmingly positive. However, there definitely were some very, very clueless, stupid, honestly, comments that reflected, hopefully an unconscious misogyny, but certainly a kind of misogyny, whether it was conscious or just merely a, unconscious regurgitation of internalized misogyny from our patriarchal culture. Yes, we live in a capitalist society. It is also a racist and patriarchal culture. So we, being socialized into that since birth, we are taught the values of white supremacy and of patriarchy, as well as capitalism. Now, as Marxists, we put class first. That is to say, we're not going to unite across classes for other statuses. But within proletarian unity, within unity of the working class, we absolutely have to learn to cooperate with each other. We live in an alienated society, first of all, where cooperation and socialization, just socializing with each other from day to day is difficult. And then on top of that, we're inundated with all kinds of subliminal and overt messages of white supremacy and of male supremacy. So unless we are actively trying to undo that in ourselves, examine it and undo it in ourselves, we're going to wind up reproducing that. And, communist economics, that's great. Obviously, we need to do that. But we also need to bring in a feminist communism as well as an anti-racist communism. We can't just port over sort of like patriarchal white supremacist communism and call it good. It's got to be all of those things, or it's going to be weak, unappealing, and most of all, unjust and exclusive and, well, just none of the things that socialism needs to be. We need an intersectional Marxism that accounts not only for class first and foremost, but also for all of the other social statuses that all of us inhabit and how that shapes our experience as proletarians as we struggle. So given that so much of the audience right now is male, it's mostly guys listening to this as I put this up on the channel, here's what we're going to do. You all are going to learn to become feminists. You're going to become versed in radical feminist theory. You're going to start to practice it, and we're going to go from there, obviously trying to include more women in the conversation and trying to cover more things that are overtly of interest to women socialists. But in the meantime, you guys have got to learn to work better with your female comrades, because I do see comments that I think any woman would read and decide to walk away because it's so, non-inclusive, so laden with unconscious misogyny that just no self-respecting woman would want to stay in the community, even if they're a communist. Even if they agree on the economic messages, they're not going to want to work with guys who clearly have an insulting opinion of women. And beyond that, beyond messages and comments that are in some way overtly misogynistic or offensive, learning to shut the fuck up, which has kind of two aspects. One, generally speaking, leaving more space for women, which is kind of a running problem. We're socialized to be first and loudest and in the front and to push other people out of the way. This can definitely spill over into internet culture, leaving more space for women to talk. Your perspective is only half the picture. You don't even know what you're missing when you're not creating space for others to feel comfortable to talk. Second of all, in addition to just leaving space for women to exist and to participate on their own terms, We are also not going to generalize about women. This is not a good thing to do basically ever, okay? There's plenty of things about being a woman and the experience of being a woman that you as a man just don't understand or don't understand very well for not having been one. You can become, more learned on this subject by becoming a feminist and devoting study to it and really listening and reshaping the way that you interact with women. But many women over time have made the comment that men often don't leave space for them. And then when they do, they will make comments, about them almost as if they're not there, or like, men just have them all figured out. So when in doubt, again, better to let women talk for themselves about their interests, needs, and experiences, and to listen when they do. And, as far as sharing your general life wisdom about, air quotes, common sense generalizations, just go ahead and don't do that. Good rule of thumb here is, would I say this thing if I were the only man in a room full of 50 women with baseball bats? So this is going to take some introspection on everybody's part. If you don't currently consider yourself a feminist, get open to it, because it's really got to happen. There was a time in my life when I was younger, in my teens, when I really hadn't been exposed to anything feminist. And I wound up falling in with a group of girls who was very feminist, and they set me straight really fast. And I feel like the faster that I picked that up, just the better I understood women's points of view, because men and women are far, far, far more similar than we are different. It might be a natural tendency to focus on the differences. Really, though, we're far more similar than we are different. However, capitalism does treat us differently, and there is definitely a gendered aspect to the division of labor and just proletarian experiences. The experience of a man of capitalism and the experience of a woman of capitalism, let alone, factoring in race and other social statuses, are not the same. So this is part of why we do this work, is to see the points of view of other proletarians who have very similar but not identical experiences as to ours. This improves our ability to work in solidarity with all of our comrades for the revolution. Okay, so with all of that said, let's get into the audiobook. Is it possible to regard the relation of the sexes in a political light at all? It depends on how one defines politics. I do not define the political area here as that narrow and exclusive sector known as institutional or official politics of the Democrat or Republican. We have all reason to be tired and suspicious of them. By politics, I mean power-structured relationships, the entire arrangement whereby one group of people is governed by another, one group is dominant and the other subordinate. It is time we developed a more cogent and relevant psychology and philosophy of power relationships, not yet considered in our institutional politics. It is time we gave attention to defining a theory of politics which treats power relationships on the less formal than establishmentarian grounds of personal intercourse between members of well-defined and coherent groups, races, castes, classes, and sexes. It is precisely because such groups have no representation in formal political structures that their oppression is so entire and so continuous. In the recent past, we have been forced to acknowledge that the relationship between the races in the United States is indeed a political one, and one of the control of collectivity defined by birth, or another collectivity also defined by birth. Groups who rule by birth are fast disappearing in the West, and white supremacists are fated to go the way of aristocrats and other extinct upper castes. We have yet one ancient and universal arrangement for the political exploitation of one birth group by another in the area of sex. Just as the study of racism has convinced us that there exists a truly political relationship between races, and an oppressive situation from which the subordinated group had no redress through formal political structures, whereby they might organize into conventional political struggle and opposition. Just so, any intelligent and objective examination of our system of sexual politics or sex role structure will prove that the relationship between the sexes now, and throughout history, is one of what Max Weber once termed Herrschaft, or dominance and subordination, the birthright control of one group by another, the male to rule and the female to be ruled. Women have been placed in the position of minority status throughout history, and even after the grudging extension of certain minimal rights of citizenship and suffrage at the beginning of this century. It is fatuous to suppose that women, white or black, have any greater representation now that they vote than they ever did. Previous history has made it clear that the possession of the vote for 100 years has done the black man precious little good at all. Why, when this arrangement of male rule and control of our society is so obvious, why is it never acknowledged or discussed? Partly, I suspect, because such discussion is regarded as dangerous in the extreme, and because a culture does not discuss its most basic assumptions and most cherished bigotries. Why does no one ever remark that the military, industry, the universities, the sciences, political office, and finance, despite absurd declarations to the contrary on the evidence that some little old lady owns stock over which she has no control? Why does no one ever remark that every avenue of power in our culture, including the repressive forces of the police, entirely in male hands? Money, guns, authority itself are male provinces. Even God is male, and a white male at that. The reasons for this gigantic evasion of the very facts of our situation are many and obvious. They are also rather amusing. Let's look at a few of the 1,000 defenses the masculine culture has built against any infringement or even exposure of its control, is to react with ridicule and the primitive mechanism of laughter and denial. Sex is funny, it's dirty, and it is something women have. Men are not sexual beings. They are people. They are humanity. Therefore, any rational discussion of the realities of sexual life degenerate as quickly as men can make them into sniggering sessions, where through cliché so ancient as to have almost ritual value, women who might be anxious to carry on an adult dialogue are bullied back into, quote, their place. At the level of common attitude, sex, and particularly that very explosive subject of the relationship of the sexes, is a subject closed to intelligent investigation and accessible only to persiflage and levity. The second evasion our culture has evolved is via folk myth. From Dagwood to the college professor, sex is folklore, and the official version of both is that the male is the, quote, victim of a widespread conspiracy. From the folk figure of jigs or punch to the very latest study of the damage which mothers wreak upon their sons, we are assailed by the bogey of the overbearing woman as some terrible and primitive natural evil, our 20th century remnant of the primitive fear of the unknown at least to the male, and remember, it is the male in our culture who defines reality. Man is innocent, he is put upon, everywhere he is in danger of being dethroned. Dagwood, the archetypal henpecked husband, is a figure of folk fun only because the culture assumes that a man will rule his wife or cease to be very much of a man. Like a dim-witted plantation owner who is virtually controlled by his far cleverer steward or valet, Dagwood is a member of the ruling class held up both to scorn and to sympathy scorn for being too human or too incompetent to rule, yet sympathetic because every other member of the privileged group knows in his heart how burdensome it is to maintain the illusory facade of superiority over those who are your natural equals. The fantasy of the male victim is not only a myth, it is politically expedient myth either invented or disseminated to serve the political end of a rationalization or a softening and partial denial of power. The actual relation of the sexes in our culture from the dawn of history has been diametrically opposite to the official cult of the downtrodden. Yet our culture seeks on every level of discussion to deny logical charge of oppression which any objective view of the sex structure would bring up. Masculine society has a fascinating tactic of appropriating all sympathy for itself. It has lately taken up the practice of screaming out that it is the victim of unnatural surgery. It has been, quote, castrated. Even Albert Shanker has discovered of late that black community control, the mayor and the Board of Education, have performed this abomination upon his person. To those in fear of castration, one word of comfort. The last instance of its practice on a white man in Western culture was the late 18th century, when the last castrati lost a vital section of his anatomy in the cause of the art of music, at the hands of another male, I must add. For castration is an ancient cruelty which males practice on each other. In the American South, it was a way to humiliate black victims of the Klan. In the ancient East, it was a barbarous form of punishment for crime. In the courts of the Italian Renaissance, castration was a perverse method of providing soprano voices for the papal choir. It was felt that women were too profane to sing the holy offices, so to supply the demand for the higher musical register, eunuchs were created through putting young men to the knife. As the practice of physical castration has been abolished, clear that the word in current usage must be accepted in a metaphoric rather than literal connotation. If we are to use any sense of the fantastic anxiety contemporary male egos, for on every hand, in the media and in the culture, both high and low, men today have come to see the terrible specter of the, quote, castrating female all about them. Their paranoiac delusions are taken for social fact. Having, in a confused way, associated his genitals with his power, the male now bellows in physical pain and true hysteria every time his social and political prerogatives are threatened. If by castration is meant a loss, through being forced to share power, with oppressed groups deprived of power or even of human status, then there are many white men in America who will suffer this psychic operation. But it will be the removal of a cancer in the brain and heart, not of any pleasurable or creative organ. To argue that any woman who insists on full human status is a, quote, castrating bitch, or guilty of the obscure evil of, quote, penis envy, only the consummate male chauvinist could have imagined this term, is as patently silly as to argue that dispossessed blacks want to become white men. The issue is not to be whitey, but to have a fair share of what whitey has, the whole world of human possibility. While I am fully aware that equal rights entail equal responsibility, there are some things whitey has which I'm very sure I don't want. For example, a green beret, a Zippo for burning down villages, the ear of a dead peasant, the burden of the charred flesh of a Vietnamese child. Nor do I have any interest in acquiring the habits of violence, warfare, unless in the just cause of self-defense, a cause I cannot ever foresee happening in American foreign policy, or the white man's imperialist racism, or rape, or the capitalist exploitation of poverty and ignorance. Because of the smokescreen of masculine propaganda, one hears endless cant about castration, whereas real and actual crimes men commit against women are never mentioned. It is considered bad taste, unsportsmanlike, to refer to the fact that there are thousands of rapes or crimes against the female personality in New York City every year. I speak of those instances only which are reported, probably 1/10 of those which occur. It is also generally accepted that to regard Richard Speck, and so many others like him, in anything but the light of exceptional and irrelevant instances of individual pathology is another instance of not playing that Speck merely enacted the presupposition of the majority male supremacists of the sterner sort, and they are legion. That his murders echo in the surrealist chambers of masculine fantasy and wish fulfillment is testified to by every sleazy essay into sadism and white slave traffic on the dirty movie belt of 42nd Street, and antisocial character of hardcore pornography. The story of O tells it like it is about masculine fantasy better than does Romeo and Juliet. So does the Playboy, chortling over the con game he has played on that rabbit. He dreams of screwing the bunny, or woman reduced to a meek and docile animal toy. For the extent and depth of the male's hatred and hostility toward his subject colony of women is a source of continual astonishment. Just as behind the glowing mirage of darkies crooning in the twilight is reality, the block, whip, and the manacle, the history of women is full of colorful artifact. The bound feet of all of old China's women deliberately deformed, that they might be the better controlled. You can work with those useless feet, but you cannot run away. The veil of Islam, or an attenuated existence as a human soul condemned to wear a cloth sack over her head all the days of her half-life. The lash, the rod, domestic imprisonment through most of the world's history, rape, concubinage, prostitution. Yes, we have our own impressive catalog of open tyrannies. Women are still sold in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere. In Switzerland, they are even today disenfranchised. And in nearly every rod of ground on this earth, they live only via the barter system of sex in return for food of the latter. Like every system of oppression, male supremacy rests finally on force, physical power, rape, assault, and the threat of assault. A final resource when all else has failed, the male resorts to attack. But the fear of force is there before every woman always as a deterrent. Dismissal, divorce, violence, personal, sexual, or economic. As in any society in a state of war, the enforcement of male rule, which euphemism calls, quote, the battle of the sexes, is possible only through the usual lies convenient to countries at war. The enemy is evil. The enemy is not human. And men have always been able to believe in the innate evil of women. Studies of primitive societies, just as studies of our own religious texts, illustrate over and over the innumerable instances of taboos practiced against women. A group of Aborigines agree with Judaism in the faith that a menstruating woman is, quote, unclean, taboo, untouchable. Should she have access to weapons or other sacred and ritual articles of the male, she will place a hex or spell upon them that their, quote, masculine owners will not survive. Everything that pertains to her physical makeup or function is despicable or subversive. Let side the village and inhabit a hut alone and without food during her period. Let her be forbidden the temple, even those outer precincts assigned to her for a specified number of days after. As the Gospels coolly inform us, she has given birth to the very Savior of the world, for she is still dirty and mysterious. Have you ever thought it curious that nocturnal emissions were not regarded as either dirty or mysterious, that the penis was, until industrialism decided to veil it again for greater effect, never considered as dirty, but so regal and imperious that its shape is the one assigned to scepters, bombs, guns, and airplanes? In history, vast numbers of people have worshipped the phallus openly. It may also be true that ever larger numbers of people once worshipped the womb or the fertility powers of the earth. It may also be true that one of the many causes for the commencement of that now universal oppression and contempt for women lay in the male's very fear of the female powers of giving life, and perhaps inspired that enormous change in world affairs we call the patriarchal takeover. Living so close to the earth, without having yet developed toys of his own in warfare and the rise of princely city-states, full of toiling slaves building him empty monuments, and unaware of his own vital role in conception, the male may well have cast glances of envy on the woman and what was, in those conditions, her miraculous capacity to bring another human life out of her very belly, and seen in it a connection with the phases of the moon and the seasons of the earth's vegetation, and stood both in awe and terror, and finally in hatred, and decided to cast this function down from what he rather naturally assumed was its collusion with the supernatural, the terrible, the uncontrollable forces of nature, and denigrate it to the level of the bestial, the pernicious, and the obscene. And thus the filthy totem was appropriated by the male, and taboo assigned in 1,000 ways to operate against the female. Having vitiated all effects of the female power, the male set about aggrandizing his own. Having finally appropriated all access to the supernatural for himself, he established an alliance with the new male god, both his brother, his father, depending on auspicious or inauspicious circumstance. He then proceeded to announce his kinship with the divine through a long and impressive list of patriarchs and prophets, high priests and emperors. Now that he had gone into partnership with God, the male set himself up as God to the female. Milton puts it this way, quote, "He for God only, she for God in him." In some cultures, females were allowed to participate on an inferior level as figures of identification for human females, useful in encouraging them to an enforced cooperation in their own control. So they can see themselves as honored through the rapes of Jove on Europa and Leda, favored in divine seduction scenarios in an endless series of wood nymphs, possibly debased versions of other tribal goddesses, at loose ends now their matriarchal reign had ended, or incarnate in that first troublesome woman Juno, the insubordinate wife. But in sterner patriarchal societies such as the Judaic and Christian, there was never any kidding around about goddesses. Christianity did not elevate the Virgin to goddess status until the 12th century, and the Protestants dethroned her a mere 400 years later. The device of making her both virgin and mother not only excites admiration for its ingenuity, but astonishment at its perfection of effect. Here is divine or nearly divine woman completely relieved of that insidious sexuality by which woman herself has always been defined. Mere mortal women in the Christian ages were continuously assured of their inherent evil and inferiority by a whole procession of fanatic male supremacists, from Paul, who found even the exhibition of their hair in church a powerful provocation and an indelicate enticement to hellish practices more apparent in his mind than in others. Such it is to represent the sexuality of the whole race in only one half of it. To Jerome, Augustine, Aquinas, and a whole parade of ascetics, hermits, and other non-participating types who have projected their own teeming sexuality onto the female. For so strong is the hold of the Christian assumption through Eve and other notable exempla that the, quote, evil of sex was introduced via the female alone, that today even women think of women when they think of sex, sexiness, sex objects, sexuality, and sex symbols, a state of rather surprising paradox in a society which rigidly enforces heterosexuality for women. Judaism is even more punctilious than Christianity in the matter of male supremacy. First thing in the morning, every male Jew is enjoined to thank God for creating him a male and therefore a superior order of being. I have never been informed as to what Jewish women are instructed to say on such occasions of coming to consciousness. Perhaps it is some little bit of advice to themselves not to fall into the much satirized posture of the overbearing Jewish mother. Of course, it is not surprising that religion as we know it takes the enforcement of male supremacy by divine fiat as part of its function in a patriarchy. So too does literature. All traditional and contemporary notions of government, those platitudes which currently pass for social science, and even, despite the influence of the Enlightenment, science itself cooperates in a number of transparently expedient rationalizations in maintaining the traditional sexual politics on grounds so specious as to have a certain comic charm. A further way in which contemporary masculine culture refuses to face the issue of sexual politics is through the reduction of the two sexual collectivities of male and female into an endless variety of purely individual situations, whereby all cases are unique, each a delicate matter of adjustment of one diverse character to another, all of them merely the very private matter of one-to-one relationships. That this is so largely our favorite method of portraying sexual relationships today, since Freud and the development of that very private science of psychoanalysis, is probably due in good part to the convenience it offers in shielding us from the unpleasant reality of sexual relations, should we begin to view them on general or class or caste terms as we have learned to see race. For we know very well now that race is not a matter between one employer and his, quote, boy, or one family and its, quote, maid, but it is to be perceived in the far more pertinent light of one's race control over the other. The individual case translates our older myth of the dangerous female into a newer, but by now rather shop-worn cliché of the bitch stereotype, the most stock figure of the contemporary media. It is interesting to note how this bitch leads one to fancy, without ever coming right out and saying it, that all women are bitches. It is puzzling, too, how, as woman, with woman's minority status and therefore a creature completely out of the male power structure, she is arbitrarily and unjustly blamed for nearly every fault in American life today, and turned into a veritable symbol of the hateful establishment. As beauty queen, the male establishment is willing to allow woman a place as mascot or cheerleader, but it is a long way from admitting her to any personal stake in the establishment's show. As a girlfriend or a wife, she may participate vicariously for a time, but she is easy to replace, and the trade-in on old models of wife and mistress is pretty brisk. She may sleep with so many thousands a year or such and such in office, but she is dreaming if she ever fancies such glory as her own. For the purpose of male propaganda, one of the most felicitous effects of the individual case myth is that it immediately translates any resistance to the present political situation in sex relations into a damning conviction of the sin of neurosis. As psychology has replaced religion as the conformist in social behavior, it has branded any activity at odds with the force quo, which, by the way, it is taken to be, quote, normality, as deranged, pitiable, or dangerous behavior. By this criteria, current, quote, normality in the United States is racism, police brutality, and ruthless economic exploitation. This is what happens if, like the shrinks, you take 19th century social life as both the state of nature and the state of a healthy society. Any woman who fails to conform to the sterile stereotype of wife and motherhood as all and only, or who fails to bow in elaborate deference to male authority and opinion on any and all questions, is clearly off her nut. Men have said it. One other device to maintain the current and traditional sexual politics is to claim that the whole thing has already been settled a long time ago, quote, we gave you the vote, as the male authoritarian puts it with such stunning arrogance. We went to the polls and elected you into the human race because one day you mentioned the oversight of your exclusion, and, obliging fellow that we are, we immediately rectified this very trivial detail. The foregoing is both a distortion of history and a denial of reality. Women fought hard and almost without hope, driven to massive and forceful protest, which has served as a model both for the labor movement and the black movement. They struggled on against overwhelming odds of power and repression for over 150 years to get this worthless rag known as the ballot. We got it last of all, black and white. Women are the last citizens of the United States, and we had to work hardest of all to get it. And now we have it, we realize how badly we were cheated. We had fought so long, worked so hard, pushed back despair so many times that we were exhausted. We just said then, give us that and we'll do the rest ourselves. But we didn't realize, as perhaps blacks never realized until the civil rights movement, that the ballot is no real admission to civil life in America. It means nothing at all if you are not represented in a representative democracy. And we are not represented now any more than black people. Both groups have only one senator, one Tom apiece. The United States has fewer women in public office than hardly any nation in the world. We are more effectively ostracized from political life in this country than any other constituency in America, and we are 53% of its population. Political nominees announced their intention of helping asthmatic children and the mentally retarded of every age if elected, but not a word about women, half the population, but not a word, the largest minority status group in history, but not one word. It is time the official fallacy of the West and of the United States particularly, that the sexes are now equal socially and politically, be exploded for the hoax it really is. For at present, any gainsaying of this piety is countered with the threat that, quote, women have got too much power, they're running the world, and other tidbits of frivolity which the speaker, strange as it may seem, might often enough believe. For the more petty male ego, like that of the cracker or the Union man in the North who voted for Wallace, in his paranoia is likely to believe that because one woman or one black man in millions can make nearly or even a bit more than he does, the whole bunch are taken over that sordid little corner of the world he regarded as his birthright because he was white and male, and on which he had staked his very identity, just because it prevented him from seeing himself as exploited by the very caste he had imagined he was part of, and with whom, despite all evidence to the contrary, he fancied he shared the gifts of the earth and the American dream. Nightmare that it is. The actual facts of the situation of woman in America today are sufficient evidence that, white or black, women are at the bottom unless they sleep with the top. On their own, they are nobody, and taught every day that they are nobody, and taught so well that they have come to internalize that destructive notion and even believe it. The Department of Labor Statistics can't hide the fact that this is a man's world, a white man's world. The average year-round income of the white male is $6,704, of a black male $4,277, of a white female $3,991, and of the black woman $2,816. As students, you live in a utopia. Enjoy it, for it's the only moment in your lives when you will be treated nearly as equals. When you get married or get a job, you will be made to see where power is, but by then it'll be too late. That is why you should organize now. Look at your curriculum and look at your housing rules. That's a start at realizing how you are treated unfairly. But the oppression of women is not only economic, that's just a part of it. The oppression of women is total, and therefore it exists in the mind. It is psychological oppression. Let's have a look at how it works, for it works like a charm. From earliest childhood, every female child is carefully taught that she is to be a lifelong incompetent at every sphere of significant human activity. Therefore, she must convert herself into a sex object, a thing. She must be pretty and assessed by the world, weighed, judged, and measured by her looks alone. If she's pretty, she can marry. Then she can concentrate her energies on pregnancy and diapers. That's life. That's female life. That's what it is to reduce and limit the expectations and potentialities of one half of the human race to the level of animal behavior. It is time we realized that the whole structure of male and female personality is arbitrarily imposed by social conditioning, asocial conditioning which has taken all the possible traits of human personality, which Margaret Mead once, by way of analogy, compared to the many colors of the rainbow spectrum, and arbitrarily assigned traits into two categories. Thus, aggression is masculine, passivity feminine, violence masculine, tenderness feminine, intelligence masculine, emotion feminine, etc., etc., arbitrarily departmentalizing human qualities into two neat little piles, which are drilled into children by toys, games, the social propaganda of television, and the Board of Education's deranged whim as to what is proper male-female role building. What we must now set about doing is to re-examine this whole foolish and segregated house of cards and pick from it what we can use. Dante, Shakespeare, Lady Murasaki, and Mozart, Einstein and the care for life which we have bred into women, and accept these as human traits. Then we must get busy to eliminate what are not properly humane or even human ideas: the warrior, the killer, the hero as homicide, the passive, dumb cow victim. We must now begin to realize and to retrain ourselves to see that both intelligence and a reverence for life are human qualities. It is high time we begin to be reasonable about the relationship of sexuality to personality and admit the facts. The present assignment of temperamental traits to sex is moronic, limiting, and hazardous. Virility, the murderer's complex, or self-definition in terms of how many or how often or how efficiently he can oppress his fellow. This has got to go. There is a whole generation coming of age in America who have already thoroughly sickened of the military male ideal, who know they were born men and don't have to prove it by killing someone or wearing crew cuts. There is also a vast number of women who are beginning to wake out of the long sleep known as cooperating in one's own oppression and self-denigration, and they are banding together in nationwide chapters of the National Organization for Women, in the myriad groups of radical women springing up in cities all over the country and the world, in the women's liberation groups of SDS and in other groups or on campus, and they are joining together to make the beginnings of a new and massive women's movement in America and in the world, to establish true equality between the sexes, to break the old machine of sexual politics and replace it with a more human and civilized world for both sexes, and to end the present system's oppression of men as well as women. There are other forces at work to change the whole face of American society: the Black movement to end racism, the student movement with its numbers and powers for spreading the idea of a new society founded on democratic principles, free of the war reflex, free of the economic and racial exploitation reflex. Black people, students, and women. That's a lot of people with our combined numbers. It is probably 70% of the population or more. It is more than enough to change the course and character of our society, surely enough to cause a radical social revolution. And maybe it will also be the first revolution to avoid the pitfall of bloodshed, a mere change of dictators, and the inevitable counter-revolution which follows upon such betrayal and loss of purpose. We are numbers sufficient to alter the course of human history, by changing fundamental values, by effecting an entire change of consciousness. We cannot have such a change of consciousness unless we rebuild values. We cannot rebuild values unless we restructure personality. But we cannot do this or solve racial and economic crimes unless we end the oppression of all people, unless we end the idea of violence, of dominance, of power, unless we end the idea of oppression itself, unless we realize that a revolution in sexual policy is not only part of, but basic to any real change in the quality of life. Social and cultural revolution in America and the world depend on a change of consciousness of which a new relationship between the sexes and a new definition of humanity and human personality are an integral part. As we awaken and begin to take action, there will be enough of us, and we will have both a purpose and a goal, the first truly human condition, the first really human society. Let us begin the revolution, and let us begin it with love. All of us, black, white, and gold, male and female, have it within our power to create a world we could bear out of the desert we inhabit, for we hold our very fate in our hands. So that's the end of the audiobook. That was Sexual Politics by Kate Millett, 1968. And I don't believe I read earlier, so I will read now a little bit of biography about Kate Millett as we start the comments. So Kate Millett was born in 1934 to a middle-class Irish Catholic family in Minnesota. She became active in the women's movement at an early stage after being active in the civil rights movement and the peace movement. At the age of 17, she attended the University of Minnesota and graduated magna cum laude in English and went to Oxford University, where she received first-class honors. Her thesis, written for Columbia University, formed the basis for Sexual Politics, a book, to become the most authoritative work of radical feminism. In 1961, she traveled to Japan to exhibit her sculptures and met the artist Fumio Yoshimura, who was to become her husband. She has taught widely at colleges in the United States. So I think that this bio was not updated. As I understand it, I believe Kate Millett died last year in 2019. This essay, of course, is 52 years old. So the context that Kate was writing in at the time was slightly different. I mean, for those of us born in, the 70s, 80s, 90s, maybe even 2000s, if you're listening, one of the younger listeners listening to this, the second wave of feminism, the first wave having been more in like the teens, 20s, 30s, had certainly had a dramatic impact by that time. One that all of us, we have all benefited from that. I just need to say, first of all, yes, capitalism still reigns. Yes, many of these ideas were co-opted to some extent by liberal capitalists in service of capitalism. And that might be the context in which we know them now. But that isn't an indictment of the ideas, just the ingenuity of liberals at co-opting shit. Marx and Engels, in the beginning of Marxism and scientific socialism, portrayed the class struggle as something that has been going on for thousands of years. Capitalism is its current form, before that feudalism, and on backwards, but thousands of years into the past. And in this essay, Kate Millett references some of the ways that in all times during that class struggle, women have been oppressed, particularly. This is, not to the exactly equal extent and not in exactly the same ways in every culture, in every century. But it's a running theme. You just don't find this level of male oppression. It's certainly a male-dominated thing. So, I mean, certainly men are limited by this as well, which is part of what Kate Millett is talking about in this essay, is that, of all the possible human traits, certain ones are arbitrarily masculine or feminine, which many people now take as, common sense, but they're really just arbitrary divisions. Consequently, men have been asked, by and large, to do more physically demanding and dangerous tasks, shortening our lifespan, making us more prone to certain kinds of injuries and things like that. But overall, what we want to get out of this, understanding feminism is that we live in a male-dominated society. It existed prior to capitalism. It still seeks to perpetuate itself in many different ways. And of course, feminists have, been very successful in recent decades at propagating these messages and pushing back to some extent. on the level of male dominance, but it still persists in different ways. You can only do so much at a particular time, and there are a lot of different issues that, there's been more progress on some issues, more awareness, more of a conversation, and then less of a conversation, less awareness in other issues. There's always backlash too. Like we saw the whole incel thing a few years ago, which of course was exploited by the far right, infiltrating those incel communities to like turn these guys into terrorists. I was reminded several times of Jordan Peterson when she was talking about the feminine being associated with the chaotic, unknown, uncontrollable forces of nature. That's like basically a Peterson quote. So this stuff is insidious. It keeps coming back, and it keeps the working class divided. It keeps all of us, basically roped off from half of our own potential, and it really particularly steps on women in a lot of ways that are particular to women. As Marxists, we don't want liberal capitalists to, just co-opt all of these concepts and use them to shore up capitalism. We need to keep calling out capitalism for the system of boundless exploitation that it is, and that, no amount of gender equality is going to fix the fundamental evil of the inequality that capitalism is, the fundamental contradiction that it is. But in building socialism, we also have to realize we're trying to end a class struggle that has been going on for thousands of years, finally establishing the classless society that represents a resolution of these contradictions. And understand, there's a lot of pain that has been inflicted on women because they were born women that we as men just might not be sensitive to. It might not be on our radars. And we've got to make a lot of space for women to talk that out and figure out, what do they want to bring to the table. And we need to leave half the table, or 53%, as Kate Millett was saying here, because technically women are a slight majority in the world population, actually. So on that note, we're going to leave it here. This was our first foray into the world of radical feminism. We're going to keep it going. And this will be both, modern authors from second wave feminism, third wave feminism, first wave feminism, some writings from, kind of the classical Marxists, Marx, Engels, etc., as well as, much more modern writers. So it's going to be a big mix of things. Let me know what you'd like to see, and we'll go from there. Thanks to the current patrons for November 2020, whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to support this channel, please head to patreon.com/socialismforall. You can sign up for as little as $2 a month. Every contribution is much appreciated. You can also remember to like, share, subscribe, and comment on this video. All of that helps to boost it in the algorithm, even if you just kind of type a random comment or like, great video, whatever. Please also share the video in your Discord groups, Facebook groups. If you're still on AOL, that's great too. Speaking of Facebook, actually, we are rebuilding. The old Facebook page got throttled to death by Facebook. There's a new one at facebook.com/socialism4all. Thanks, and we'll see you in the next video.